What's up, guys? This is Mr. Eldridge, and in today's video, we're going to look at the Great Depression. The Great Depression had many factors that led to the crash of the American and the world economy. One of the earliest signs of economic decline came in the agricultural sector. With a high demand coming from the war in Europe from 1914 to 1918 and more accessible credit, farmers had the demand and money supply to purchase equipment, land, and grow large amounts of grains and food. Once the war ended, demand for food declined in the United States, especially as Europe later revitalized their own agricultural production. This left many farmers with surpluses of food and consequentially lower prices. Much like in the 1890s, farmers chose to produce more food to make up for the low prices, which in turn drove prices down even further. By the mid-1920s, many farmers had to declare bankruptcy, lost their farms, and loans went unpaid to the banks. This same cycle of overproduction occurred, albeit a bit later, in the manufacturing sector. As credit and more efficient production produced massive supplies of goods, demand began to diminish, and consumers either had the items already or could not afford to purchase more with their rising debt. Much like in the sector of agriculture, businesses were left with surpluses and falling prices. This forced many businesses to either lay off their workers or go out of business. In either case, many people were left without incomes and unable to pay off their debt, which had been accrued through accessible credit. Additionally, the newly popularized stock market offered a great way to get rich quick in the early 1920s. The issue of credit in stock purchases, known as buying on margin, i.e. paying a portion and getting a loan for the rest of a stock or set of stocks, became problematic. Stocks are a share of the company, generally speaking, if the company does well, and almost all companies were in the 1920s. The stock price would rise and one could sell the stock for a large profit. This trend fairly consistently provided investors with a way to develop and grow their wealth so long as stock prices kept rising. While one could get rich quick on risky investments in companies, buying on margin resulted in skyrocketing prices that eventually led to inflated prices and a burst bubble. In short, when stock prices reached absurdly priced levels in the late 1920s, people stopped buying them, causing prices to plummet. The first major shot came on October 29th, 1929, known as Black Tuesday. As prices are too high, stockholders were left with overpriced stocks for which they paid and borrowed large amounts of money for, serving as a net loss for them and the banks. Banks lost not only through the defaulting of loans, but through their own failed investments as well. While the stock market itself would make somewhat of a recovery, panic and doubt in the American financial system had begun to set in, and the banks were quickly in trouble. All three factors, agricultural overproduction, manufacturing overproduction, and the stock market crash, caused several small banks to go out of business. Unlike today, anyone with money in those banks simply lost their savings. This caused a panic across the United States as people rushed to draw their money from banks for fear of losing it all. This is known as bank runs. As such, larger and larger banks began to fail, and with faith in the American economy went with it. With a frozen banking system, American companies and consumers were unable to procure loans to purchase goods to start businesses, which led to dropping incomes, layoffs, and increasing unemployment. Arguably, the Federal Reserve or federal government could have provided loans to the banks to prevent them from failing, but no action was taken by the laissez-faire administration. Additionally, the impact of the economic decline rippled to Europe, as the Germans as well as other Europeans were dependent on American banks to provide loans. The same was the case for Imperial Japan, who suffered greatly from the failure of the U.S. banking system and ensuing unemployment of American workers. Also during this time, you have what's called the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was a period of severe dust storms that greatly damaged the ecology and agriculture of the American and Canadian prairies during the 1930s. Severe drought and a failure to apply dry land farming methods to prevent the wind erosion caused this phenomenon. During the drought of the 1930s, the unanchored soil turned to dust, which the prevailing winds blew away in huge clouds that sometimes blackened the sky. The Dust Bowl forced tens of thousands of poverty-stricken families to abandon their farms, unable to pay mortgages or grow crops, and losses reached $25 million per day by 1936. Many of these families, who were often known as Okies, because so many of them came from Oklahoma, migrated to California and other states to find the Great Depression had rendered economic conditions there little better than those they had left. And finally, it's important to look at the effect that the Great Depression is going to have on minorities in the 1930s. While many blacks migrated north and west through the Great Migration to escape segregation, they still faced racial discrimination in other areas. The NAACP continued to fight for voting rights and anti-lynching laws, but many urban blacks became increasingly frustrated with racial discrimination. For example, several riots broke out in 1930s Harlem, New York, regarding discrimination against blacks in the business world. Such issues would remain largely unresolved until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Despite the fact that the Immigration Act of 1924 greatly limited the amount of non-Western and Northern European immigrants to the United States, immigrants from Latin America quadrupled in the 1920s due to the stipulation that allowed increased immigration from the Western Hemisphere. Most of these immigrants came from economic opportunities in the construction of cities, infrastructure projects, agriculture, and railroads. By the 1920s and 1930s, a large portion of fruit growers and fruit pickers were Latin American, mostly Mexican laborers. However, this loophole was soon ended as reforms in immigration policies made it harder to obtain citizenship or legal residency, and the implementation of financial and literacy tests. The initial onset of the Great Depression fell on Republican President Herbert Hoover and his administration, who, being laissez-faire, free market economists, took a more hands-off approach to the Depression. While Hoover did attempt to provide some aid and public works, such as the construction of the Hoover Dam, he advocated letting companies and markets set the problem straight over time themselves. Hoover believed that private charities and volunteer work, known as volunteerism, were the most appropriate way to provide help, and that the federal government should remain largely out of the lives of citizens. In fact, he believed that over time, this economic bubble would fix itself. While his ideals may have had some economic foundation, the laissez-faire approach was politically unpopular. Citizens simply saw a president who cared little for their plight, and his name soon became associated for the homeless shelters in towns constructed from cardboard and debris, known by most as Hoovervilles. So, gaining popularity for calls for reform and government aid, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, won the election in 1932. Of course, sworn officially into office in 1933. FDR and his advisors would borrow heavily from the ideals of John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who believed the federal government could help solve the problem. Keynes believed that the root of the problem was unemployment. According to Keynes' theory, with no jobs, people had no money to spend. so the economy was unable to grow and recover. Keynes suggested the federal government fund public works to provide employment in mass. It would theoretically provide the unemployed with incomes, increase the demand for goods through increased consumption, and start the cycle of spending and economic growth. Coined demand-side economics, as the government was used to stimulate or create demand through the job creation, it was only meant to be a temporary solution. To fund these jobs, the government would need to borrow heavily from domestic and international banks and other countries. Spending money a government does not have is known as deficit spending, and the money would need to be repaid later on. The idea was that once the economy had begun to recover, the government would theoretically slow spending and allow private sector to grow. As the government spent less and less, the tax revenue grew with the revitalized economy. It would focus on repaying those debts. So FDR put into play what he referred to as his New Deal. FDR believed this method of Keynesian economics would work. Therefore, he took an interventionist approach, one that believed the federal government should, at least at times, interfere in the economy and be involved with the individual lives of Americans. FDR convinced Congress to pass a series of laws and reforms known as the New Deal. The New Deal created jobs through power companies such as the Tennessee Valley Authority, this being a public power company, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, also known as the CCC. This was a public work relief program designed for unemployed, unmarried young men. Publicly funded projects designed to provide incomes for unemployed men and women. Not a part of Keynesian economic reforms, FDR also convinced Congress to pass the Glass-Steagall Act, which limited the actions of banks and increased requirements for individuals to receive credit loans. This was meant to prevent people from taking loans that were too risky. The FDIC protected citizens who held money in banks by insuring their accounts to a point so that not all of their money would be lost if the bank failed. He also explicitly broke from the Keynesian economic model by providing poor aid through welfare food programs and started the Social Security program, which was paid into by workers as they labored and was paid back to them at retirement to act as a sort of pension program. With this partial approach, federal spending increased substantially, but unfortunately for Americans, the Great Depression would continue until Keynesian spending kicked in fully during World War II. During World War II, the implementation of massive military production programs and increased federal spending would provide employment and promote spending, resulting in economic recovery in the 1940s. The United States would, however, continue to deficit spend for the majority of the following decades. The New Deal itself had opponents from both sides in the form of conservatives and the radical left. Conservatives such as Al Smith and other business leaders opposed the New Deal as an alleged socialist attack that sought to undermine laissez-faire economics and American freedom. Many conservatives criticized the deal as a socialist plot. On the radical left, figures such as Upton Sinclair argued the New Deal didn't go far enough. Far left opponents argued that the only way to combat economic equality and an economic depression was to mandate cooperative factories and to nationalize banks, a method that is openly socialist. However, the New Deal played a pivotal role in the realignment of American political parties. In some, the New Deal realigned the working class and minority groups with the Democratic Party. Part of the New Deal included the Wagner Act of 1935 that guaranteed the rights of labor to organize and collectively bargain. This greatly increased the rights, trade, and labor in organizations such as the AFL. As a result, the Committee of Industrial Organizations was formed with the AFL in 1935, known as the Congress of Industrial Organizations in 1939. This, as well as other labor developments, resulted in union membership skyrocketing from 3 to 8 million people in the period from 1933 to 1941. Democratic calls for the reduction of inequality and protection of worker rights under the New Deal also recruited African Americans. A growing industrial demographic as the NAACP continued to combat segregation and abhorrent practices such as lynching in the South. As such, the social justice and pro-regulation core of the former progressive movement combined with the interventionist policies and worker protection to form the modern left-wing Democratic Party. Thanks so much for paying attention to this video. If you have not subscribed to this channel, please go ahead and do so now. Thank you so much and have a great day.